There's Disney villains. There's Dr. Eggman from the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. And then there's Marvel villains. Considering that Disney has bought, well, Marvel and Star Wars, it does make me wonder how much of a catastrophe would be if all the villains come together. And how much awesome it would be if all the heroes from the Disney movies and Marvel movies and Star Wars movies come together. When did Marvel villains get good? I'm more of a movie guy, not more of a comic book guy, even though I sometimes check those out whenever I'm bored. But let's see how it goes. Well, also...
Hello, I'm the Nostalgia Critic. I remember it so you don't have to. Let's talk about how Marvel movies are destroying cinema. Yes, they may be fun and exciting with good characters, comedy, drama, and action. And yes, they've allowed us to bring what we thought we couldn't bring to the big screen and people that are so familiar they almost feel like cinematic family to us now. But there's just too many of them. Some of them, I dare even say, are not great. Out of their 20 hit movies that came out in the past 10 years, 4 of them were kind of meh. I'd even go so far as to say, eh. It's not like we went through a dark age of cinema where the majority of films were creatively and emotionally bankrupt. It's not like Marvel movies are anything compared to those masterpieces. I'm sorry, I like Marvel! I get why it's popular to argue they're repetitive and there's too many of them, and sure, a lot of them aren't even that bad arguments, but even before the MCU, Hollywood was running on creative fumes. Imagination and good storytelling was kind of a rarity, and they were still repeating the same ideas and stories just in really shitty ways. Marvel isn't perfect, but it's constantly entertaining and constantly turning out much better films than that dark age of cinema I mentioned earlier. I'd much rather watch the worst of Marvel with at least their charming main characters than the majority of what came out for years and years. The reason I bring this up is to show that I am a giant Marvel Cinematic Universe fan. But there is one criticism that everybody makes that I tend to agree with too. The villains suck. It's funny how Disney, the current owners of the MCU, have turned out some of the greatest cinematic villains in history, yet in recent years they've been hitting some duds. Marvel, I guess fittingly enough, is the same way. Ever since their first hit with Iron Man, the villains have always been not awful, but underwhelming. They're boring, uninteresting, kinda silly, and even when they're given a good backstory or reason to be evil, they just seem unpassionate. Now don't get me wrong, the comics they come from usually have a lot of great emotional development, as well as interesting story threads, but the movies, despite doing a lot of other things very well, never seem to reflect that. Even when Samuel L. Jackson was trying to defend Marvel, he had to hand victory over to DC when it came to the villains.
There's Marvel, where you have heroes, and there's DC, where you have interesting bad guys.
It seems that, again, like recent Disney, the focus seems to be on making the main characters more interesting and complex. Which many people would agree is probably the more important element. And yes, there is an irony that early on, Disney properties seem to be focused on making the villains more charming and complex, while the title characters seem secondary in terms of interest or passion. But of course, the focus should be making the hero and the villain equally interesting. This is admittedly tough though, especially when for years people didn't take your medium seriously. Comic book movies are big hits now, but for a while they were seen as box office poison. Nobody wanted to make them, they were seen as kid stuff, too corny. So not only did focus have to be on the hero having emotional substance that could be taken seriously, but it had to be done in not just one film, but a lot of films to show this is a genre worth paying attention to. So, for a long time, we got forgettable antagonists, usually with complicated plans, very little personality, often just a dull stick in the mud. Despite many of them being played by good actors, they never left the impact that made their original characters so engaging. That is, except for Loki. Everyone seemed to like Loki, despite him being, and let's be fair here, often pathetic. He looks silly, nothing goes his way, he's constantly outwitted, and his motivation might be the weakest out of any of the villains. He just wants attention. But with that said, that is a very relatable motivation. Therefore, we do always feel empathy for how things never go his way. And on top of that, he's just funny. For a while, he was the only Marvel villain who smiled. He enjoyed being the trickster, the manipulator, the one that made everybody's life an obnoxious hell. I think a lot of us can connect with that joy that ties to our inner troublemaker, doing something wrong to get something that you want. Outside of Loki, though, Marvel offered very little that stood out. Honestly, if you ask me who was the second most intimidating threat in the early run of these movies, I'd say Gary Shandling whispering Hail Hydra. That's how unimpressive things got. With such an unimpressive lineup, many thought that the presentation of Thanos, the ultimate villain that had been built up for several movies, was never going to deliver on what was being promised. But then, somewhere around 2017, things started to change. In Guardians of the Galaxy 2, we got Kurt Russell as Ego. He was a surprisingly good villain. Then in Spider-Man Homecoming, we got Michael Keaton as Vulture, another surprisingly good villain.
Spider-Man Homecoming. it's kind of funny that Michael Keaton once went from being a good guy to being a bad guy as the Vulture.
Then came Thor Ragnarok with Cate Blanchett as Hela.
I love her, by the way. I'll talk about it.
Along with Jeff Goldblum as the Grandmaster, Black Panther with Michael B. Jordan as Killmonger, and finally Infinity War with Josh Brolin as the long-awaited Thanos. That's 5 movies in a row, hell, 6 if you count Ant-Man and Wasp, that delivered strong, interesting, passionate, funny, unforgettable villains that finally seem on par for some of our most iconic heroes. Suddenly, 6 movies in a row, the antagonist was just as much fun to watch as the protagonist. So, what happened?
Yeah, what did happen?
How did these baddies go from miss after miss to hit after hit? What were these villains doing that these villains weren't? Well, I don't think it's one specific thing, but I do think all of them have several elements in common. And I'm not lying, fangirls. I think they're all elements that you could tie back to Loki. Yep, all the ingredients that made these baddies so memorable all took a page from Loki's cookbook. And before I go any further, it's probably worth saying, duh. Let's take a look at Guardians of the Galaxy 2. Ego, throughout the majority of the film, is a likable guy. He's a jokester, he's a visionary, he's a go-getter. For him, you can get anything you want if you just try hard enough. Like Loki, he was the only one who started smiling, enjoying what he did, thus we enjoyed watching him. He's easy to like, which makes it all the more heartbreaking when you find out what a psycho he truly is, and serves also as a cautionary tale about who you can trust, even if it's a parent. This lesson wouldn't be nearly as dramatic if we didn't enjoy watching him as much as we did. In Spider-Man Homecoming, we got a lower middle-class worker who was screwed by Stark Industries and the government leaving.
Yeah, villains being made by heroes being dicks. That's one of the reasons I hate Spider-Man Homecoming, kind of.
His job and life in the dust. Like Loki, he was overlooked and forgotten, and wanted what he felt was owed to him. His relatability comes from the idea that he's a common working guy. So much so, that's an absolute shock when you see just how common he is. Switching back and forth between prom chauffeur and murdering mastermind showcases how little the loss of human life can be to him, demonstrating his creep value. In Thor Ragnarok, we get a banished sister Thor never knew existed. Like Loki, she looks extravagant, enjoys her evil side, and can even get out a good one-liner here and there. But let's be honest, Loki looks far more fabulous in feminine green outfits. She can be funny, but she can also be quite menacing. Not just in how physically powerful she is, but also her over-the-top demeanor in killing someone. Look at that face, that is hardcore. On the other end is a comedic overlord who wishes to entertain while also being entertained himself. He's kind of like the ultimate couch potato, just sitting around in his robe. Except the shows he watches are real people, and he cares nothing if they live or die. Again, with both of these villains, there's a strange attraction to having so much power you can just do whatever you like and act however you want to act, going as big and crazy as you want, just in different ways. Of course, pushing to the point of hurting innocent people is what separates us from siding with them, but still their underlying enthusiasm for what they do is addictive to watch. In Black Panther, the opposite approach is taken.